Hi, everyone. My name is Julie Garden Robinson, and I'm a professor and food and nutrition specialist. And I was asked to talk with you about something new in nutrition. And the newest thing I could think of was telling you a little bit about the new nutrition facts labels that you will be seeing on almost every food product very soon. I want to discuss what's new and what remains. So in part one, I will be telling you a little bit about some history as well as the updates to the nutrition facts labels. And in part two, we're going to try something a little different. I really wish I were with you in person to play the game, but we'll try it virtually. So I have a bingo game, and so you'll need to download a card. And then, of course, I have to have prizes if we're playing bingo. So we have some prizes that you will be able to sign up to win. Here's one of my favorite cartoons. Back in the day when carbs were the big nutrition issue, my girlfriend dumped me for some guy with less carbs. You might recognize that character. Now let's step back in history a little bit. Before the 1960s, there was very little information on labels about nutrient content at all. In fact, from the 40s to the mid 60s, if calorie or sodium content was listed, the food was labeled for special dietary uses. By the 1960s, we were seeing more women in the workforce and therefore more processed food appearing in grocery stores. Well, back in 1973, which is quite a long time ago now, the FDA developed nutrition labeling in response to a White House conference. And in those early days of nutrition labels, we saw things like calories, protein, carbohydrate, and fat, along with some vitamin information. And that was based on 1968 data. And actually, these same sorts of data sources were used and continue to be used up until recently. And in addition to the vitamins, sodium, saturated fat, and polyunsaturated fat could be listed at that time at the discretion of the manufacturer. Then along came the Surgeon General's report on nutrition and health in 1988, and we began to see even a greater emphasis on the role of nutrition and health. The initial Nutrition Labeling and Education Act only covered foods overseen by the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, and it required nutrition labeling on most food packages and specified serving sizes as the amount customarily consumed. There also was voluntary labeling for raw fruits, vegetables, and fish. And to this day, we do not see apples labeled with a nutrition facts labels. So that voluntary usage really never transpired. Along came 1994. Think back to those days. Then we had a new label placed on food products. And there were no changes from 94 until 2006 when we began to see trans fat labeled. Later, we also had sugars labeled, but those included added and natural sugars up until now. So sugars have been there a long time, but recent guidelines have changed how sugars are listed. Why are they changing? Why do they keep changing everything in our world? Well, research continues to go by, and the new labels that you will see, and in some cases are already seeing, reflect new scientific research that shows an even greater link between diet and chronic diseases, including obesity and heart disease and a lot of other diseases, cancer, for example. And the whole idea behind having labels, nutrition labels on products, is to allow consumers to make informed food choices. So these new rules came about 4 years ago now, in 2016. So what are the changes? So here is the new nutrition label. On the right side compared to the left side is the current one that continues to be on some food products depending on the size of the manufacturer. If you look, and if I were with you in person, I'd ask you, what do you notice? And I'm sure you'd say, the calories are bigger. The serving size is in bold. And there are some new things that are on the label. So if you compare them side by side, you can really see that there are some differences. And I guess the biggest difference is the huge size of that calorie designation. So here we go. Let's go through this. Serving size, larger, bolder font. Calories. It's the largest size font on the label. And according to their rules, it can be no smaller than size 22 font. So you will notice the calories. You're not going to be able to squeak by and pick it up. It's going to be in your face. What else is happening? Well, they've updated the serving sizes to be more realistic to what people eat. So for example, your breakfast cereal, the old serving size used to be 3/4 cup, and now it's up to a cup. Ice cream, half cup. The serving size is now 3/4 cup. This doesn't mean you have to eat 3/4 cup. It's just telling you that when you look at the nutrition facts label on ice cream or bagels or cereal or whatever it happens to be, all those numbers are based on the serving size. Bagels, continuing on, a half a bagel used to be the serving size, but what they were finding is that people were not eating a half bagel, they were eating the whole bagel. So suddenly your favorite bagels did not increase in calories, it's just the serving size increased. They also updated the percent daily values, and these are there if you have a food product in front of you to tell you how the nutrition in this particular food relates to an entire day's diet. So if it says 10% of the daily value, that's 1/10 of everything you need for the day. And this also reflects the new evidence that's been used to create the 2015 to 2020 dietary guidelines for Americans. So if we take a look in perspective here, you can see that some things stayed the same in terms of the daily value and some things have either decreased or increased. So the old daily value, if you notice on a nutrition label, used to set fat grams as the recommendation basically was 65 grams per day, and now it's up to 78. Total carbs went from 300 down to 275. Sodium, daily recommendation, went from 2,400 down to 2,300, which is going to be a little difficult to stay within that depending on how many processed foods that you might like to eat. The dietary fiber recommendation for people 4 and older went from 25 to 28. Added sugars is brand new to the label. We never had added sugars, we just had total sugars. And that, of course, increased because it wasn't there before. Vitamin D is now on the label, and that has increased. Calcium remains on the label, but that also has increased in terms of the daily value. I've already had questions from people saying, well, how did my cup of milk go from 30% of the daily value down to 25%? And this is the reason. The basis of that percentage changed because they actually increased the daily value to 1,300 milligrams. Iron stayed the same. Potassium is new to the label. It could be on labels if they wanted. Now it has to be on labels. Really important for your heart health, your muscle contraction, nerve impulses, and all those sorts of things. So these are the big changes that are happening and a little bit of why they are making these changes. Most of us, for example, do not eat enough fiber. We consume way too much sodium. So this is to put it in perspective of the whole day's diet. So if you've ever seen on a food product low in something or high in something, they can't just randomly put those things on the label. If it has less than 5% of the daily value, it's considered low. If it has more than 20% of the daily value, it's considered high. So they have legal definitions, and a manufacturer can't come along and say, yes, this is high in fiber. In order to have that designation, they would have to have 20% of the daily value. Now we have added sugars, and that always confuses people. I think this is very helpful that they've now separated total sugars from added sugars. Added sugars were not there in the first place. Natural sugars were originally present in that food. So if you like fruit juice, those have natural sugars. Milk has natural sugar in the form of lactose. But if you add chocolate milk powder that's sweetened, you've just added some sugar to that milk. So those two added together become total sugars. There are some exceptions. So if you pick up honey, honey does not have added sugar. Honey always had that sugar content. It's actually considered natural. And this is why Julie gets a lot of questions about this topic because it is kind of confusing. And I do a lot of work with food companies on this very topic. So again, what's the difference between added and total? Total is natural sugar, such as in fruit, as I mentioned, plus added sugar, like table sugar, high fructose corn syrup, or other sweeteners. So added sugars are included in total, but listed separately to help all of us see how much sugar has been included. So there's a change in the nutrients required. So if you always looked for fruit juice that was high in vitamin C or vitamin A, they no longer have to put those nutrients on the label. They can, but they don't have to. Calcium and iron are still on the label. In the place of vitamins A and C, we now have vitamin D and potassium. Vitamin D is important because those of us who live in this cold Midwest where we don't have a lot of sun might be deficient in vitamin D. And it's important for a lot of reasons, like keeping our bones and teeth strong, and also for a lot of other functions in our body. Potassium, as I mentioned, is good for our heart, our nerves, and our muscles. So these are important nutrients, and they are somehow lacking in our diet, depending on our food choices. They took away this designation of calories from fat, but they still have total fat, saturated fat, and trans fat. And the ones that I want you to especially look for are saturated fat and trans fat. Trans fat is the type of fat that's probably worst for us in terms of heart health and so on. It's typically found in hydrogenated foods, but it is found in small amounts in some natural foods. For example, it's in some meat, it's naturally produced, but the worst type of trans fat would be the type of fat that you'd find in hydrogenated oils to make margarine and some of our shortenings. So look for trans fat on the label, and that's the one that we want to have the least amount of. Total fat, if it's oil, is perfectly fine. In fact, we were getting so into skipping fat altogether that actually it wasn't doing our health any good. So use more oils, use less solid fat would be my best advice. And now on the label, we also have a revised footnote. So we used to have a giant piece of information at the bottom of the nutrition label. And the footnote is this area at the very bottom where it says the percent daily value. It explains what it is. It's now easier to understand. It's shorter, and it explains that daily value. So the amount of the nutrient in a serving of food and how it contributes to your daily diet. And that's based on 2,000 calories. Now, we all don't need 2,000 calories. Some people need less, some people need more. But as a overall standard, they use 2,000 calories, and they have for a long, long time. So the deadlines to make these changes, so you might be seeing it on some of our largest food companies. So if you buy Kraft and Pillsbury and those sorts of products, they had until January 1st, 2020 to come up with these new nutrition labels. The smaller manufacturers have an extra year and maybe even longer now with the current situation. But originally they were to have until January 1st, 2021. So this is the end of part 1 of my presentation. I am happy to answer your questions by email, but in part 2, we will be having some fun. Since you've heard the academic part, now we're going to actually play a bingo game. So I hope you join me for part 2.